They're actually in a little chapstick container that's been used up, and I just keep my earplugs in here. I know it's the red one. It's the one with the red. That's not chapstick. Or sorry, I love earplugs. I think they are one of the greatest inventions. It's just like it turns down the volume on life. And I love silence and solitude. And so I have this picture. This was taken last year from Tam O'Shanter, FSR at Sunset. I love to sit in places like this and pray. Spend time with God, listening, pondering. I have multiple places up above my house, up the Redfish FSR, that I can be to in 20 minutes, and it looks like this. It raises an interesting question for us: is how do you practice solitude and silence? I'm curious. Just those of you who have been practicing it, how do you practice it? What does it look like? Jack. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, just sitting quietly in your room. Yeah, in a favorite chair. Who else? Be still and I'm I'm God. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Tracy.
I wake up before all the kids get up.
Before all the kids, yeah. Yeah, we'll talk some about that. Yeah. Gina.
I go into the forest behind my house and sit on my favorite stump and just sit.
Right. Right. Yeah. Anybody else? Turn off your cell phone, right? Get rid of it entirely. You guys are...
I go somewhere where
Somewhere. Sorry, Neil. Did I?
Because I don't really have an answer to that question.
I was gonna say I didn't know the bus ran by here. I think. Yes, this is something that we need to practice. If we read it carefully, we will see that Jesus' ministry was fueled by solitude and silence. Jesus' ministry was marked by a retreat to solitary places. After his baptism, he spent 40 days in the desert, or in the Greek word, it's eremos, which means deserted place, or barren place, or solitary place. It was in the midst of ministry that he took his disciples away, said, hey, we need to go away, and we need to be with God. It was after John the Baptist was beheaded that Jesus went away to a solitary place. It was after feeding 5,000 that Jesus sent the disciples in a boat, and he went up to a mountain to pray. It was on the mountain where he went with just 3 disciples and then left them and went further on by himself, and he was transfigured. His face shone bright like the sun. It was also at Gethsemane where he went with those same disciples and said, you guys stay here and pray, and he went further on by himself and prayed before he was betrayed and then went to the cross. It's not surprising then that Luke would write this. He would write, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. It was Jesus' regular practice to get away, to solitude, to silence, and to be with God. It was John Mark Comer, a pastor, who pointed this out in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, that Jesus' first foray into ministry came out of and ended with Jesus stealing away to a solitary, deserted place for silence and prayer. It was right after the beginning of Mark's gospel where he talks some about John the Baptist. Then in verse 9, he talks about Jesus coming to be baptized. Jesus is baptized, comes up out of the water. You hear the voice of God saying, this is my son whom I love. I'm so pleased with him. It tells this in Mark chapter 1, verse 12. It said, at once, so like right after Jesus comes out of the water, at once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended to him. Now this wilderness, there's 2 times the word wilderness is used here. This is, you guessed it, the word eremos. It's used throughout the Gospels talking about a solitary place or a deserted place where Jesus was alone. After that, Jesus begins proclaiming, so he comes out of the desert, out of this solitude and silence, and begins proclaiming good news, proclaiming that the kingdom of God is near, repent and believe. Then he went and he called Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the first disciples. He went to Capernaum and he taught in a synagogue. He cast out a demon while he was teaching in the synagogue. Then he went to Simon Peter's house afterward and healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And then more people started showing up at the door and he was healing them throughout the night. And then Mark tells us this. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went out to a solitary place where he prayed. Once again, Jesus steals away to a solitary place and prays. Once again, it is eremos, a deserted place. It's interesting because Peter and the rest of the disciples, they come looking for him and they find him and they say, Jesus, everyone is looking for you. You're a huge, I'm paraphrasing here, you're a huge success. Like, let's capitalize on this. Things are really taking off. Let's get going. We don't want to miss this opportunity. And Jesus replies to them, let us go somewhere else, to nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. There are two things that I want to point out that John Mark showed me or in his book was, first is that Jesus' spiritual life was rooted in solitude and silence. And it was out of that solitude and silence that he clearly heard the voice of God. No other voice, he didn't hear other voices who were saying, do more of this or be more of that or you should do this. He was actually just listening to the voice of God and he came out confident in that, focused on what God had called him to do. In the eremos, Jesus clearly heard God's direction and moved faithfully in it. Jesus' spirituality was rooted in solitude and silence. In fact, most of the influential Christians over the last 2,000 years have practiced solitude and silence. Some of the most famous names that we know from Christian history were also deeply devoted to solitude and silence. It's actually interesting to think that we would actually be an anomaly if we don't practice solitude and silence as Christians. A famous author and spiritual director, Henri Nouwen, wrote this, without solitude it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. That is a strong statement. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside time to be with God and listen to him. Dallas Willard, another renowned modern authors on discipleship and spirituality, he writes this. He writes, solitude is generally the most fundamental and beginning of the spiritual life, and it must be returned to again and again as that life develops. These are two Christians who have devoted enormous amounts of time and thought and prayer to discipleship, to spiritual formation, to growth. And they're saying virtually the same thing. We need solitude and silence as disciples. Now I'm going to get into some ways to practice it. I'm going to get into that. But first I need to say some important things about why it's so important in our culture. We live in a digitally distracted age. Rick, you mentioned turning off your cell phone. Trina, you mentioned throwing it away entirely. Some people refer to it as the attention economy. You know all those free apps you get on your phone? Do you know why they're free? Because you are the product that they're selling. Your attention. You are what they're selling. Companies have learned how to monetize and sell your attention to other corporations so they can sell you stuff and make money off you. In fact, there are whole teams, there are whole consultant groups that are filled with behavioral scientists learning how to maximize the dopamine hits that come from us using like phones and devices so they can get us hooked on them even more. So we'll spend even more time on them. I know one person, and I'm not going to tell you who because they would be embarrassed. They are retired, and when I ask them, hey, what'd you do today? They say, I got up in the morning and then, I don't know, got it going about noon. I said, well, what did you do I was on Facebook for hours on Facebook. But it's not uncommon. I mean, go to any mall, right, guys? Any place where you see young people gathered around. I'm impressed, boys. None of you are on your phones right now. Good job. That's great. But I mean, things like phones, Netflix, Facebook, advertisements, all of these things that distract us, all of it is noisy and distracting. I agree with Catholic Father Ronald Rolheiser. He says, we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. And interesting, it's a digital arms race. It's not just staying the same, it's actually increasing all the time. It used to be, like for example, if you were a church and you had like some way to let people know, maybe you like put it out in a bulletin, hey, these are the next few things that are coming up. You maybe had announced it like a few weeks in advance. But now, as a church, you are urged by, church consultants or people here, and even some people in the church saying, we need to have a Facebook page. And actually, you need to have a Facebook page that sends out, that has push notifications every day, or else people stop looking at it, and it goes down in the algorithm or the computer that kind of shows you what to look at based on what you look at. And it stops showing the stuff of the church, and pretty soon you're not shown at all, and you're forgotten. It's like that in almost every aspect of life. Politics, news, advertising, businesses, they're always sending you stuff, and they feel like they have to send you more and more, or else they get drowned out by all the noise. I was thinking about this. It's like trying to live in a van full of noisy kids who they've all learned that the only way they keep your attention is by talking louder and more often at you. That's right, wear earplugs, right? It's loud, it's constant. Actually, it's not even constant, it's increasing, and it's distracting by design. Andrew Sullivan, in his article titled, I Used to Be a Human Being, writes this, and I'm going to read it out because it's worth it. He writes, modernity slowly weakened spirituality by design and accident in favor of commerce. It downplayed silence and mere being in favor of noise and constant action. The reason we live in a culture increasingly without faith is not because science has somehow disproved the unprovable, but because the white noise of secularism has removed the very stillness in which we might endure or be reborn. So what do we do? What do we do with this? We get away, with Jesus. I meant that other way, but we get away with Jesus. We get away with Jesus for a lot of reasons. But 3 stuck out to me this week. One, because it helps us grow personally, helps us grow as a human. We need to talk about silence so much because we talk so much. Now, there's a lot that's behind this, but just some things that came to me this week is, why do we talk so much? I think part of it is anxiety or fear that what will happen if we don't say something. We can feel like we need to fill up silences. Does anybody here feel uncomfortable with silences sometimes? You're talking with somebody and all of a sudden it goes quiet for a while. I see some of you shaking your head, no, that's wonderful. I was thinking about, some people when they're afraid, they go absolutely quiet. Some people when they go afraid, they can't stop talking. So that's one reason why we talk so much, is anxiety. Another is pride. Pride in the one sense of thinking, I've got really important things and everybody needs to hear them. There's some people who think that. Then there's the flip side of pride, which is insecurity, people who are worried that I don't really have anything important to say and people won't value me, so I'll just try to say a bunch and hopefully something sticks. Or people who act like they know a little bit about everything because they're afraid that you might not value them. Some of you might know somebody who's like that, who talks about everything as though they had written a dissertation on it. And you know that they didn't. And actually as you listen to them, you think, I don't actually think you know what you're talking about. But you just keep talking. Pride is one of them. Another is power. People talk a lot for power. Sometimes it's well-intentioned, trying to control the situation for the good. Sometimes it is malicious intent. Sometimes there are people who want to control a situation to their own ends. They talk over people and they ramrod discussions because it's about power. They want to win. Why do people talk so much? Practicing solitude and silence can help us. It can help us to trust God to deal with anxiety, trusting Him and no longer afraid of the outcome, or trusting Him for it. Solitude and silence can help us grow in humility as we listen to God. Learn to listen to others more than trying to convince them of our own opinion. Learning to listen, allowing people to be themselves while we remain ourselves. Silence and solitude can also help us learn to sacrifice, setting aside our power to listen to others, to help them, to be a blessing to them. Not trying to control them or manipulate them, but rather letting them share what they need to share. So some reasons why we talk so much, we need solitude and silence because it's a great way to grow. A great way to grow in character, grow in things like humility. When you're able to sit quietly and listen, humility will grow, especially if you are listening to God. We realize that God is above us and we are his servants. Solitude and silence can help us grow in wisdom as well. It's hard to learn when you are talking. I think there's actually a proverb or something like that. It's impossible to learn while you are talking. There's a saying that you learn from experience. And I don't actually think that's true. And I've heard some others who've said this, that said, you don't actually learn from experience, you learn by reflecting on experience. And you need solitude and silence to do that. Knowledge is knowing stuff. There's lots of people who know a lot of things. Wisdom is having knowledge and knowing how to apply it. That's wisdom. To be a person of depth, a person who says things that are meaningful, not just blathers on, you need to take time to think deeply. The trouble is, in our culture, few people do this today. It's why our culture is so shallow. People are living too fast, they're too busy, they're living too noisy and too distracted. And so they talk about things like the weather and Instagram and Netflix shows, rather than deeper things of meaning and import. Solitude and silence also helps us grow in patience. We learn to sit quietly, as painfully as it can be if you sit for a long time, to sit quietly, patiently waiting for God. You can't rush God's revelation in your life. Don't ever say, God, hurry up, I need you to get to the point of this. It won't go well. We sit and we wait. It builds peace in us while we wait, and shalom. And it's worth the wait to boot. Solitude and silence help us grow as people. It also helps us grow closer in community. In his book, Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote essentially, beware the person in community who doesn't know how to be alone. And beware the person who is alone who doesn't know how to be in community. His book, Life Together, is this tiny little book that he wrote as he was starting a small Christian community in Germany during the time of the rise of Nazism. And he started this small Christian community Bible school, and it had 5 chapters. The second chapter was the day in community. The third chapter was the day alone. And he talked about the interplay of both those, that needing both of them were essential. The point being is that we want to avoid becoming codependent, where we need people to fill us up, where we come to the community asking people to fill us, and we come drawing and sucking from them rather than coming to contribute to them. Now, it's true, like some people come here and they are struggling. And I'm not talking about like people who are at the end of their rope and they need help. Like that is a legitimate reason to come. Just come. But once we've been here a while, and once we've begun to grow and to recover, for us to become people who are healthy through solitude and silence, to come and contribute to the group as well. That we learn to be alone so that we can return to community in a healthy way, bringing with us Christ-like character, wisdom, patience, humility, not pride or anxiety or the desire to control. We get away to grow in community, and we get a way to grow closer to Jesus, to become more like him. Solitude frees us of distractions, nobody coming up disrupting us in our connection with God, whether it's a phone call or a bing from a text or even a beloved child. We need solitude and silence to hear the still small voice of God, to hear God's whisper. It's hard to do. I'd say almost impossible to hear it in a noisy life. We need silence and solitude to hear it. Solitude helps us see our limits as people as well when we rely on God. For some people, it's very frightening to go off by yourself alone and sit quietly and wait for God. But trust me, it is rich time. All of this helps us rely more and more on God. All of this helps us to do what Jesus did. As we've already pointed out, Jesus practiced solitude and silence. That should be reason enough for us to want to practice it ourselves. But this is my contention. This is my point, is that if we practice and do what Jesus did, we will become more like him. Solitude and silence were a vital part of his spirituality. It's a vital part of almost every Christian leader throughout the history of the church. Silence and solitude has been a practice they've done. It's a great way to connect with Jesus, to do what he did, and to become more like him. So just briefly, like, what could solitude and silence look like? And I've tried to think about different situations. I mean, solitude, first, it's pretty self-explanatory, like by yourself. Ideal, maybe the ideal, I mean, for me, people like me, ideal would be to go to an eremos, to a deserted place, to a Forest Service road high up on the mountain. For some of you, it might just be going into the woods near your house and sitting on a stump, or your favorite chair and looking out your window. We go to these places to be alone. And then some of you might be thinking, and Tracy, you mentioned it, like getting up early enough to be alone. And that might have to be something that you do as well. If you have people who live with you, maybe more than just your spouse, or even if your spouse, sorry, Cheryl, you get up early for solitude. I mean, this is something that even I do. I use my earplugs, and I go into the office in our house when the kids are all doing stuff, and I put in earplugs, and then I put in earmuffs over the top of that. It's weird, but it works. I don't hear anything. And I shut the door, and it's quiet and solitude. We could do that as well. I just want to make the point that it doesn't have to be elaborate. Don't let the idea that you have to be up at some remote place keep you from doing it. You can do it in your home, early in the morning before everyone's up, or even with lots of earplugs and ear protection, you can do it. So that's solitude. The second is silence. Again, an ideal is to go to a deserted place where it is naturally silent, where you don't have jackhammers or cars driving by or Harleys going by on the highway, or even breezes and streams that can provide some white noise that help silence things. Definitely where there's no cell service is helpful. That's a way to be silent. But also I mentioned you can bring silence with you. Like I keep my earplugs in my bag, my computer bag. So when I'm in town, I have meetings, I can go to the library and put those in, and it goes completely silent. And I can be with God, even in the middle of the public library. Or in a quiet room in your house. There are ways to get silence in your life. But I also want to make this key distinction between external silence and internal silence. There are things we can do to get external silence, and you don't have to wear earplugs and earmuffs over the top. You don't have to do that, but it does help. That gets the sound out of life. How do we get the sound out of us? Quiet the mind, right. Sit quietly, pray, listen, because it does. It's very common, and I don't want you to feel guilty about it. People who sit down to pray and they start doing the shopping list, or the chore list, or the plan for vacation, or the plan for people who are coming. That's okay. Often when I pray, when I'm trying to calm down, I imagine myself like glass that's been shattered, and then all the pieces are spread all over. And I start praying, I start imagining gathering all those pieces back together to sit quietly and listen. We live these fragmented lives, all of these things going on, distracting us, to gather everything back together and to sit quietly before God. That we quiet ourselves internally as well, so that we can begin praying, Lord God, please help. That we can begin journaling, and hopefully not just like introspective journaling, which can be very helpful, but even, Lord, what are you saying to me? And just capturing that as it comes. Or even if you're able to just sit quietly and listen And when you're distracted, realize, oh, I'm distracted now, and just come back to God and listen again. Sitting in silence and listening. This morning, we have been talking about how important solitude and silence is. We've been talking about how essential it is for our faith, how essential it was for Jesus' spirituality even. But I also want to point out what a gift it is. It is a gift to us. And I know it might, for some of you who, especially who are more extroverted, it might feel like, oh, not my favorite spiritual practice, but still, I am confident, even for you, it would be a gift. It is a gift, and it helps us grow spiritually ourselves. It helps us grow to be healthy in community when we gather back together with people. Not only that, it helps us grow closer to God. It helps us grow closer to Jesus, doing the exact things that he did. Going to deserted places and praying is exactly what it did. Doing what he did to draw closer to him, to become more like him. Because this is the amazing news. God wants to be close to you. He wants to be close to all of us. And so he calls us to this practice. He's given us this practice as a gift. That we'd realize more deeply who he is and that we would grow closer to him. So practice solitude and silence. Amen.